It's shocking to realize that in a world overflowing with resources, nearly 1 in 10 people suffer from addiction, and many battle mental health issues alongside it. Addiction and mental health are closely intertwined, and the reality is sobering. Untreated mental health issues often deepen addiction struggles, while untreated addiction only makes mental health issues harder to heal. Integrated treatment solutions, where addiction and mental health are addressed together, are essential. Yet, despite how essential these solutions are, getting there can feel like climbing a mountain with nothing but the weight of shame and isolation on your back. Looking back, I remember hitting rock bottom. My life felt hollow, defined by a cycle of desperate highs and crushing lows. It wasn't just the craving that haunted me, it was the constant noise in my head, an overwhelming storm of voices telling me I was worthless, that I'd never escape, that this was my life. And maybe that was the hardest part to accept, knowing that my brain was betraying me as much as the addiction was. The addiction had become a way to numb the hurt, to silence the inner critic, to find a few hours of peace. But then the silence would give way to shame and regret that struck even harder when I was sober. Each morning, I'd promise myself that it would be different, that this would be the day I'd finally break free. But by the evening, those promises would crumble under the weight of cravings and darkness. The anxiety was a constant companion, lurking in the background even on my best days. Just going to work felt like running a marathon. Every social interaction was exhausting, my mind spinning with the fear of judgment, the dread of being found out. Would they notice? Could they see the emptiness in my eyes, the hollowness in my laugh? It felt like I was walking around with a neon sign that screamed, "I'm broken," and it took every ounce of strength to keep that mask in place. And the worst part? I couldn't even explain it to the people I loved. How do you tell your family that the addiction you promised you'd stop is the only thing keeping you afloat? How do you make them understand that the pills, the bottle, the whatever it took became a lifeline, a way to cope with the gnawing depression that had lived in my mind for years? It was as if addiction and mental health had woven themselves together so tightly that they were one, an inseparable darkness that blocked out any light. People would tell me to just quit. Find a hobby, they'd say, get out more, try to exercise, find a positive outlet. But these words, though well-intentioned, felt like slaps across the face. It wasn't a matter of just quitting. Addiction wasn't some hobby I could set aside or a habit I could outgrow. And the mental health struggles didn't let up either. They were relentless, gnawing at my willpower, eating away at whatever resilience I thought I had left. Late at night, I'd lie awake with my heart racing, convinced that if I fell asleep, I might not wake up. The reality of losing everything weighed so heavily that I'd just sink deeper, turning to the very things I knew were killing me, desperate for a moment of relief. I was terrified of dying, but I was equally terrified of living in that endless loop of shame and despair. It was like being in a house that's burning down around you, but every door leads to another room filled with flames. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to run, and so I stayed trapped in that cycle, even as it consumed every part of who I used to be. The toll it took on my relationships was devastating. Friends drifted away, family members stopped calling, and the support system I once had crumbled piece by piece. I remember one holiday, sitting alone, trying to drown my loneliness in anything I could find, while scrolling through photos of my family gathered together without me. I had become a stranger to the people who once knew me best, and it was all my own doing. The loneliness fed the addiction, and the addiction fed the loneliness, creating a vicious cycle that seemed unbreakable. On one particularly dark night, I found myself staring into the mirror, unable to recognize the person staring back at me. My skin was pale, my eyes hollow, and the spark that once defined me had long since faded. I felt like a ghost, a shell of who I used to be, and I knew that I was losing myself completely. It was terrifying to realize that, despite all my efforts to escape, I was slipping further and further away from anything I could call normal, from anything that felt remotely like peace. What made it all the more heartbreaking was the guilt I carried, the shame of knowing that my struggle was hurting the people who loved me. I could see the pain in my mother's eyes, hear the worry in my father's voice, feel the disappointment in every word from my friends. They wanted to help, but they didn't know how, and I didn't have the heart to tell them that I didn't know how either. The shame of letting them down ate away at me, driving me even deeper into the addiction. I felt like I was dragging them into the darkness with me, that I was the cause of their pain, and it felt easier to push them away than to let them see the mess I had become. It was in these moments of isolation that the mental health struggles felt the heaviest, a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to remember a time when life wasn't filled with this constant ache. I was drowning, and every attempt to save myself felt like reaching for air in a sea of darkness. The addiction whispered promises of relief, but each time I gave in, it only pulled me further under. At that lowest point, I didn't know if I'd ever escape the grip of addiction and mental health struggles that felt like they'd consumed my entire world. But something inside of me, maybe it was just a tiny spark, urged me to try one more time. I couldn't keep living in that empty, broken cycle, so I made the decision to start with the smallest, simplest step I could manage. I decided I'd ask for help, real help, from people who understood both the addiction and the mental health struggles that fueled it. It took every ounce of courage to make that call, to admit I couldn't fix it alone. When I walked into that first treatment center, my heart pounded, my hands were shaking, and I felt like everyone in the room could see through me. But there, I found people who didn't judge, who had lived through their own battles and understood how intertwined addiction and mental health were. It was the first time someone truly saw what I was going through, saw the weight I'd been carrying, and I didn't have to explain or justify it. They got it. And that understanding, that acceptance, was the first bit of relief I had felt in years. In the early days, the focus was on breaking things down into manageable steps, even if it was just learning to get through one day, then another, and eventually a week. They guided me in finding small habits, simple routines that felt so trivial at first but were transformative over time. Daily meditation, journaling, and moments of reflection slowly became a lifeline. These practices helped me understand what triggered my addiction, and I started recognizing the moments when I reached for the substances to cover up my emotions or escape my thoughts. There were still times when the anxiety felt unbearable, when depression made it impossible to get out of bed, but now I had coping tools I could rely on. Mindfulness, breathing exercises, grounding techniques, these weren't just random methods, they became my daily tools for managing the intensity of my emotions. It's amazing how something as simple as focusing on your breathing can anchor you, can bring you back from the edge when your mind is racing with fears and doubts. Eventually, I found myself connecting with a support group. At first, the idea of sitting with strangers and talking about the shame, the mistakes, the battles I had fought seemed too raw, too vulnerable. But sharing my story and hearing theirs created a bond that pulled me further out of that isolation. We supported each other, celebrated each other's victories, and lifted each other up in moments of doubt. These people became more than a support group, they became my lifeline, a family who understood without me ever needing to explain. One of the biggest hurdles I faced was learning to forgive myself. That guilt, the sense that I had wasted years, hurt people, and failed myself, lingered heavily even as I made progress. Therapy helped me start to release that weight, to see those past choices not as unforgivable sins, but as experiences that brought me to the place where I could finally start to heal. Forgiving myself didn't happen overnight. It was a journey, a gradual softening of the harsh inner voice that had been my constant critic. Learning to be compassionate with myself, to see my past with understanding rather than judgment, was one of the most liberating parts of my recovery. As my journey continued, I noticed a shift. What had once been an endless battle just to survive was starting to feel like living again. My days weren't just about getting through them. I was starting to find joy in small things, to see possibilities that I hadn't seen in years. My relationships began to heal. That pulled me further out of that isolation. We supported each other, celebrated each other's victories, and lifted each other up in moments of doubt. These people became more than a support group, they became my lifeline, a family who understood without me ever needing to explain. One of the biggest hurdles I faced was learning to forgive myself. That guilt, the sense that I had wasted years, hurt people, and failed myself, lingered heavily even as I made progress. Therapy helped me start to release that weight, to see those past choices not as unforgivable sins, but as experiences that brought me to the place where I could finally start to heal. Forgiving myself didn't happen overnight. It was a journey, a gradual softening of the harsh inner voice that had been my constant critic. Learning to be compassionate with myself, to see my past with understanding rather than judgment, was one of the most liberating parts of my recovery. As my journey continued, I noticed a shift. What had once been an endless battle just to survive was starting to feel like living again. My days weren't just about getting through them. I was starting to find joy in small things, to see possibilities that I hadn't seen in years. My relationships began to heal. Friends I had pushed away came back into my life. Family members saw the changes in me, and slowly, the trust one thought I had lost forever began to rebuild. This journey through recovery didn't happen in a straight line. There were setbacks, times when I felt like I had failed all over again. But each time, I knew I had a choice. I could return to the path of self-destruction, or I could keep pushing forward, no matter how hard or slow the progress felt. This was when I truly understood that recovery wasn't about perfection. It was about resilience, about getting back up each time I fell, about honoring the progress I had made, no matter how small it seemed. The more I healed, the more I wanted to keep growing, to keep exploring ways to strengthen my mental health and sustain my sobriety. That's when I found a book that would change my perspective even further: Addiction and Mental Health, Integrated Treatment Solutions. This book became a guiding light for me, offering insights and practical strategies for managing the ongoing challenges of addiction and mental health. Reading it, I felt like the author understood every part of my journey, every struggle and victory. It was as if they had lived it themselves. The book helped me realize that recovery is a lifelong journey, one that requires compassion, patience, and the right tools to thrive. The practical advice in this book gave me more than just solutions. It gave me hope, showed me that I could create a future beyond addiction and darkness. It explained the importance of integrated treatment in a way that I could relate to and apply in my life, strengthening my resilience and helping me build a sustainable path forward. It was more than a book. It was like a friend guiding me toward my own unique path of healing. If you're struggling, or if you know someone who is, I encourage you to grab a copy of Addiction and Mental Health, Integrated Treatment Solutions at LibriFFY.com. The link is in the description. This book can open doors, light the way, and remind you that recovery is possible, no matter how lost you may feel.